I thought I'd do this in half of what it takes to go to these islands and what the problems are, and then give you a little flyover of the 3 U.S. Fish and Wildlife islands I've been to on Dxpeditions. So you can see some fish and birds. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service things are rare for a reason. The purpose of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to protect the islands. And users like ham radio, birders, divers, we're way down the list of important things. And this committee I'm on, which is rewriting the rules of the Pacific Islands, one of the things I'm trying to overcome with some divers who are also on this committee as representatives of users is to get the biologists to understand that, yes, the purpose of a reserve is to protect the species, but that shouldn't rule out what they call recreational users. Luckily, the NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service people have been along on all the ham radio trips. So they know we're good stewards. So it's not that there's 2 sides fighting each other, but we're trying to codify in the rules that ham radio is an approved use, birding is an approved use, diving is an approved use. So why are the 6 DXCC counters in the PRIM rare? Well, it's who controls it. Number 7 on the list is Cure Island. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a say in who can go. And the Hawaii Fish and Wildlife people have a say in who goes. Now, when the Coast Guard pulled out of Curie, they left behind an environmental mess. All the equipment there, when they used to do oil changes, they dumped the oil. They left behind buildings with asbestos. And Hawaii has spent over a dozen years cleaning up Curie. So I happen to know the administrator of Curie, and the last ham radio Dxpedition in 2005, Cynthia was part of it. She got in an argument with one of the hams. And until Cynthia retires, I doubt you will see another ham radio expedition there. And luckily, she's retiring in 2 years because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife people have no problems with a Dxpedition. So that's why Curie hasn't been on in 2005. Johnston's a different problem. Johnston is, again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Air Force. About 20 years ago, somebody on Johnston was moving a plutonium bomb and dropped it. And it leaked some hazardous radiation, and all they did was dump sand on it. It's not capped. It's not cleaned up. And if you ask the Air Force, you want to go there and play ham radio, all they think about is liability. So the Air Force has a standing rule. Nobody outside the government can go to Johnston. And that's why it's been since 2003. And I don't see a change in that happening until they decide, for budgetary reasons, they don't need Johnston anymore. And I'm told that there's actually discussions with NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife to take over Johnston. Midway is one of the good spots. There's a compatibility determination done. We were there in 2009 at K4M. If you want to go to Midway, that probably can happen. There's nothing getting in the way. Same thing with Palmyra and Jarvis. The Nature Conservancy took over Palmyra. They do ecotourism, and for a measly sum of $100,000, get a bunch of guys together and go to Palmyra. Jarvis, which is the co-DXCC island, can be gotten to by getting a U.S. Fish and Wildlife special permit. And actually, we were well along in that process before COVID, and the compatibility determination was never completed. And I think you'll see some movement on that in the next year or so. Baker Howland, we were just there. Compatibility determination was done for that for Baker. If you want to go to Howland, you need a different compatibility determination. But since that was just on 3 or 4 years ago, I don't see anybody going back for 7 or 8 years. Wake Island, it's co-managed by Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Air Force. It's not particularly hard to get permission to go. And probably you'll see that on the air 2 or 3 years again. Usually after 10 years, these things usually get another visit. Remember, none of these places are cheap to get to. We spent about $150,000 on the boat to get to Baker. To get to Baker. Midway, you have to rent a private plane to get there. Well, you don't have to, but that's how everybody gets there. Okay, a history of the PRIM. It started in 2009 with a presidential proclamation. Before that, there were a bunch of little reserves. Johnston Island, believe it or not, was a bird sanctuary way back in 1926 and was taken over during the war by the military. It was expanded quite a bit in 2014. NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife are all part of the Department of Interior and the Department of Commerce, and they co-manage most of the Pacific Islands. National Wildlife Reserves also are Baker, Howland, Kingman, Palmyra, as you see. Baker, Howland, and Jarvis all joined in 1974 as reserves. The reserves place restrictions mostly on commercial activity. They don't really prohibit, as the acts are written, recreational uses, as I mentioned, ham radio, diving, or whatever. You just need a permit. Most of these islands became part of the U.S. when the U.S. took them on the Guano Act of 1856, and the U.S. Navy was strong enough that the U.S. declared these islands, also the ones in the Caribbean. And then, of course, World War II came, and the islands were occupied by the military, including Jarvis, which is really small. One thing is that ham radio has been on most of these islands going back into the 1930s. And that happened because the state of Hawaii, with the Army, decided they would colonize these places. And they took these Hawaiian high school students and assigned one non-military, because they didn't want to militarize these islands and piss off Japan. So they took like Boy Scout leaders or recently retired military people, dropped about a dozen off on each of these godforsaken little islands that had no water or trees or anything, and set up these little huts just so they can claim colonization and economic zones. Sort of what China did recently with the Spratlys, some of the islands, and BS7, where they grabbed them out from under the Philippines. So it's nothing new. What China did, the US did it in the 1930s. So here is the 2 steps of creation of the PRIM, the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. Those little circles were originally the individual islands And then and they were 83,000 square miles in total. But in 2014, they basically said everything in between these is part of the monument also. And that increased the square mileage to 491,000 square miles. I mean, it's huge. It's the second largest marine monument in the world. The first one, believe it or not, being the area around Guam. So how do you get a special use permit? As I described in the first chart, everything's different. There's no one cookbook. So first you have to convince the U.S. Fish and Wildlife that you want to go there. Ham radio hasn't been activated in a while. It's so far up the needed entity list, and they're pretty receptive after 10 years. No one's going to go back to Baker, as I said, for another seven years or so. Then they have to do a compatibility determination. The compatibility determination will say, we're going to go there and we're not going to destroy the ecosystem. We're not going to do anything that violates the reason of having a bird sanctuary or a wildlife reserve. And the first one I got involved with was back when we did Midway in 2007. And we worked with Matt Brown, who was the island manager, and we showed him antenna pictures, and we showed him the footprint on the beach and the fact that there were barracks and we could stay in the barracks. And he approved it. I took that and went several years later, and we got basically the identical contaminant compatibility determination done for Baker. Now, I wasn't involved in the last Wake Island Dxpedition, but I understand they used the Midway one to do the one for Wake. And once you do a compatibility determination, it's forever. When I went to Wake back in 1995, they didn't require one. And in fact, today they may not require one because it's mostly controlled by the Air Force, which will give permission. The way it works is you spell out what you're going to do, number of antennas, how it's not going to affect the island. You're going to have berms around the generators. It gets published. People can comment on it. The one for Baker, we had like 5 comments in 3 weeks. And they were all, this is great, you got to do it. No one really questioned. One person said, you can't just have verticals, you need yaggies. But the biologists think that a bird is going to fly into a yaggy, but it won't fly into a vertical that's 70 feet tall or 60 feet tall. I gave up trying to convince them that it doesn't matter which orientation an antenna is. But in fact, and you probably know this, verticals work better on a beach than a yaggy. So it doesn't really hurt ham radio unless you're trying to do moon bounce, whether you have a vertical or a horizontal yaggy. So the CD will spell out how many antennas they think is right for the size of an island, how many people should go, whether or not you need a latrine, things like that. And as I said, they publish it, people comment, and then after that's approved, you can apply for a special permit. So the best argument is we take the fish and wildlife people, biologists, to the island for free. The NOAA boat has been in and out of dry dock now for 3 years. Fish and Wildlife used to have a boat. They don't. And it had been 11 years before somebody visited Baker. And we took Fish and Wildlife there and saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars so they didn't have to charter a boat. That is the single best argument. We'll take you there. The second best argument is hundreds of thousands of hams will see the publicity, and That is good for Fish and Wildlife because it advertises the islands. The one thing that doesn't work is we're citizens, we own these islands, you have to let us go. Believe it or not, people say that to the Fish and Wildlife people. One went so far as to get his congressman to write to the Department of Interior saying, you have to let my constituents go there, or I'm going to affect your budget. Well, not only did that not work, but I don't think the person that got that congressman to write that letter in, I think it was 2015, to this day, they remember that person. I don't know if he's ever going back in the Pacific because of that attitude. SUPs are specific. If it says you can go for ham radio, you can go for ham radio. While you're there, you can't go swimming, you can't go diving. When we were on Midway, we started making a movie. And Matt Brown, the administrator, said, hey, wait a minute, you can't film. You don't have a permit to do that. And he went to Portland, where the administrator for Fish and Wildlife was, and on the fly, they granted a permit so James Brooks can make a video. Okay, let's talk about Baker Island and the special use permit. For 2 years, our group worked with Fish and Wildlife. We got a compatibility determination done, and we were invited to apply. When we were invited to apply, so did 3 other groups, because it was published that they were taking applications for a special use permit. They weighed the group, whether the group had been to other islands, whether they knew us, whether we'd been anywhere recently with them. So our group got the special use permit. The conditions were the boat we took had to be inspected had to depart and be inspected at a U.S. port. And the closest U.S. port happened to be American Samoa. We chartered a boat out of Fiji. We had to deadhead it to American Samoa, where it was examined, found that it didn't have any bad stuff growing on the hull. They sent divers down, and that happened. The Fish and Wildlife people determined where we would have the camp set up. All our clothes had to be frozen, and they had to stay in Ziploc bags after they were frozen. They had to be new. We couldn't take certain types of toothpaste or other items that had chemicals in them, like suntan lotion. It had to be natural. The power generators had to be in berms. The tents had to be frozen and defumigated. We also always had to have 7 days of food on the island, because the Howland group, way back 20 years ago, got stranded because of a storm, and they only had 2 days of water. And Beth Flint, who was the biologist back then, said, from now on, 7 days in case of a storm. Things like that. They limited the operators to 11, vertical antennas. Again, no fishing, swimming, couldn't take anything off the island, even shells. And we had to clean up when we left. And we wanted to name it after Amelia Earhart, and we even had to get permission for that. Midway was different. Midway, they did the compatibility determination. And then Matt Brown in October, no, it was January of 2009, sent everybody that ever asked to go to Midway a letter saying, first come, first serve, sign up if you want to come and be a ham radio tourist on Midway. Within an hour, all the slots were gone. And we were building a team not from friends or fellow Dxpeditioners that we knew. It was wide open. Luckily, 5 of us who had been to, let's say, I was 2009, who had been together in Africa, we became the core of the team. And this is just the letter that told us where we would stay in the barracks and what we would do. And everything was subject to rules by Matt Brown, who was the administrator, where we'd put the antennas and what have you. Wake was much easier. Back in '95, Tom Harrell, who's now N4XP, was in the Army, and he was a fire chief, and he was assigned to go to Wake to train them in procedures. And while he was there on one trip, he talked to the base commander and said, hey, you know, when I come back in 3 months for phase 2, I'd like to bring 3 of my friends to do ham radio. And they just said, sure. I mean, they weren't doing missile testing back then or anything on Wake. So 4 of us went, and without any compatibility determination, without an SUP, we got to operate for a week. So let's look at Baker Island. We went on a ship called Anaya. This is the crew of hams. The woman all the way on the left is the Fish and Wildlife, Allie, the representative. That's the boat. As I said, it was about $150,000. These are the operators. We had all been to other fish and wildlife places, Midway, Wake, Palmyra, Navassa, Desiceo. There were 3 of the team that had never been anywhere, but that wasn't the problem. The Fish and Wildlife approved our crew. It's a large boat, 120 feet. It normally takes 18 customers diving. This is their backyard. They know the area, they know the waters, they know the weather. We took 2 tons of gear. We air freighted it to Fiji. That was the tour. The Naya left Fiji to go to American Samoa. 6-day sail to Baker. We operated until July 5th, 10 days. But since we were on the return and not going in the reserve, they let us bypass American Samoa and go right back to Fiji. There were more crew members on this boat than hams, and that came in handy dragging all the equipment over the reef. Chef, the food was really good. The portal view of my cabin. The seas were fairly calm. We had a couple of days of roughness. Baker is right above the equator, and right after we got over the equator, we started seeing the birds. Here's our first morning view. You can see in the center, the day house. It's not really a lighthouse. There's no light, so it's a day beacon. The birds, 8 million of them. When the Army left at the end of World War II, there weren't any. They shot as many of the birds as they could because they were landing planes. Here we are, heading to the island. The NOAA people have lost many skiffs on this reef. There is just one small area where in World War II they blew out enough to get the boats through. It's mostly grown back, but they recommended to the Naya people this specific skiff because it had such a small imprint in the water. And this is where the Fijians came in handy because they dragged all our equipment on the beach for us. Allie, our fish and wildlife biologist, just became a crew member. She helped put up the tents. There's more of the equipment. You can see the water in those big blue barrels. This is Baker Island. You can still see in the center where the landing field was from World War II. You can see some of the area in the north, which was where the barracks were. And we set up our tents on the left side of the island, which is also the only area of the island you could go over the reef. Here's another view, north to south. We had a CW site all the way in the north with 3 stations. We had a EAT tent in the middle with the sideband tent right there, 3 stations. And we had 2 digi stations in the smallest tent all the way on the south. They were separated by about 500 feet in each direction. everything was internet. We had power over internet repeaters. We had 5 antennas at the CW site, 3 antennas at the sideband site, and 3 antennas at this Digi site, including a 6-meter vertical. It was E-season, but verticals on 6 just don't cut it. These are the weather port tents we used at VP80RK. We had them in storage. We took out the insulation and they were fine. Here's the eating tent. Food was brought in for lunch and dinner from the boat. Here's some of the antenna construction going on. It was about 125 degrees on the beach. You couldn't stay out there very long. Lots of breaks. Here's the CW antenna farm we put up. You can see the birds in every single picture. And you can see the flags were, all the antennas were flagged. We only think we had 1 bird strike the whole time we were there. And we're not even sure the bird was damaged by a bird strike, because birds die all the time. There's another view of the center of the island with the day beacon and some tents. This is the Hilton that we set up. During the day, those tents got well over 120 degrees. It was just oppressive. Allie had her own little tent off to the side. You'll see the drone there. We weren't allowed to fly drones. Only Allie could fly drones on the island. If you look at that blue thing in the lower right, we thought we'd dig a hole and bury that as the latrine throne. The problem is you dig down about 1.5 feet and you hit solid coral. They just kept pounding away at it. At the end, we said we just can't get it low enough. There's a barrel at the bottom of that because we weren't allowed to leave our waste. We had to take it back off the island. That was fun getting up on and closing in the middle of the day where I had to be 140 in there. We had a shower. That's the generators. As I said, everything had berms around them to protect against spills. Elecraft radios, wireless keyboards, everything was networked. We had 31 possible band modes. One Japanese station actually made 30 of the 31 possibilities, and the reason he missed the 31st, Japan doesn't have 60 meters. Here I am with Kevin, the other co-manager. Quick view of operating. This was the digital station. We were planning on doing RTTY and FT8. And after the first 2 or 3 days, it became obvious that one person could run both those stations in foxhound mode and do 300 an hour versus 80 or 90 in RTTY. So there we go, SO2R. Baker Island was the very first use of foxhound, for those who know FT8. When we were preparing to go, AA7A, who was on the committee that helps suggest things to Joe Taylor, suggested a split operation, because as you know, if you use FT8, everybody's on the same frequency. And we worked with them and came up with the 1.9 version, which had fox and hound. That made a huge difference in the run rates. One interesting thing is, just because you do foxhound, you still get pirates. And people, when we came back and I was doing the QSLs, kept saying, wait a minute, I have screenshots of our QSO. What is wrong with you? And OE7MPI was really adamant that he made a good Q, and he sent me the screenshot. And I noticed a CQ with the grid square KO77, which happens to be downtown Moscow. So we were pretty sure we knew who this pirate was. They say it never rains on Baker. Well, there's some of the never rain clouds. Seemed every afternoon we got a storm coming through. We got there, the sign was in disrepair. It had been a dozen years since anybody had been there. We fixed it. Allie was happy. The flags of the team. A couple of shots of birds. As I mentioned, in pre-World War II, there was a settlement there. There's still some of the remains of the guano activity and the settlement they did back in the 1930s. And again, when the military pulled out, they left a mess behind. And it's still pretty, here I am riding the tractor they left behind. The birds. Every morning, you knew the sun came up because you could hear them heading out to sea for, these are terns. As I said, there's about 8 million birds on the island. Frigate birds, terns, brown-footed boobies, tropical birds. Sunsets were amazing on this island. Now, you live on the West Coast, so you see this kind of stuff all the time. But the day beacon. There's another one on Howland. That's what Amelia Earhart was supposed to use to find the island. This is what happens to the day beacon during the day with the crabs. After 8 days of operating, it was time to leave. While we were there, we cleaned up 15 bags of debris from around the island. So Fish and Wildlife was pretty happy with us. As we left the island, the Baker Island dolphin pod made sure we left. And as in most Dxpeditions, the ride home is festive. 3/4 of the money came from North America, which is usual. The team put up half the money. Because we went not at a good part of the cycle, there were almost no openings on 10 and 12, so 40 meters was our 40, 30, and 20 meters were our money bands where most of the queues were made. 27,000 queues, as I said, just on 20 meters out of 69,000. CW was our main mode. We did a lot of FT8, almost as much as sideband, but twice as many CW queues as the digital modes. Most of us were CW operators, I guess. The QSL, hopefully you guys all worked this. I'll do a very quick, do I have time? Yeah, very quick. Midway, as I said, it was a fly-in. One of the first things they made us do was learn how to pronounce Papahanaumokuakea. And Matt Brown had a great thing coming by. What's this island? There's the team. As I said, we had to charter a plane to get there. That's Matt. Here I am setting up some of the radios. We were in the bar. So it was not a 120-degree island visit with generators. We flew in some of the antennas. I made just under 60,000 queues. Again, 20 meters was the best band. We were there to give new ones, so we always had stations on 20 meters. Some of the turns. We were allowed to go when there were no albatross on the island, because during mating season, you get hundreds of thousands of goonie birds. The last day there, 2 came in, and they told us a week after we left in October, there were hundreds of thousands of them. They just came in waves. Crabs were everywhere. 1996 was my first DXpedition to the Pacific, and it was wake. There were rotting guns from World War II, revetments from the planes, and the rock where the day before the US reclaimed Midway from the Japanese, the commander of the Japanese post took the remaining 98 sailors that were still on the island and executed him. He was executed after the war. 447 men defended Wake. I think less than 100 survived the concentration camps. One of the bunkers. This is the Pan Am dock. Pan Am was using Wake as a landing spot to the Pacific. The lagoon. We did AO-10 satellite, 220 up, 2 meters down. The tri-band beam, it's a lot different than you see Dxpeditions today. You'd never get away with one beam on a Dxpedition. Here we are operating, and questions.
Which island do you think is most likely to open up first for us for a Dxpedition?
I think your next one you will see will be Jarvis.